This is June 12, 2023. My name is Bruce Anderson. I'm associated with the Walter Rett Center for Adventist History at Pacific Union College. Next to me is Jim Reynolds, who is the president of Ultimate Mission. Ultimate Mission is an international health promotion ministry, really, that Jim leads. And I'd like to maybe begin this little discussion. It's a conversation with a little story. And I have this story in mind. It occurred in August of 2023, and I think it's a simple act of kindness that kind of defines Jim Reynolds and defines, it's an example of what Ultimate Mission really does. So what I have in mind is an Ethiopian man on the ground. And what happened to that man, Jim? Do you want to pick that up and tell that little story? It says so much about you, I think.
Well, it's just, it was a wonderful story about what our organization is doing. And we were in Ethiopia and we were partnering with It Is Written, an evangelism series they were doing there. And we were doing the health program before the evangelism series. So we would come in at 10 in the morning and then work right up until the evangelism series. And then Dr. John Anderson, your son, was there with me. And he noticed this man walking, kind of crab walking on the ground with these two things that he held in his hand that he would use so he wouldn't bruise his hands up. And Dr. Anderson noticed that, I think, if I remember right, that the one leg was still good. And he was thinking, boy, if this guy had crutches, he could stand up and walk. And so he told that to me, and I went out looking for crutches. And that was kind of my job, is to go figure out, where we could find stuff and the kind of the gopher. And I couldn't find crutches anywhere. I had brought a set of crutches, and it was the crutches that I packed with me. They were fold-up crutches. They were really nice, but they were, I was going to be leaving in a couple days anyway. So I went and got the crutches, and we brought them to the man. And sure enough, just as Dr. Anderson said, he was able to stand up and walk on the crutches, which was a huge improvement. And so right before I was going to leave, I just gave him the crutches, and the man was all smiles. You can see the video on our YouTube channel of me giving the guy the crutches. It was a neat thing. It really was.
Well, I think that says a lot about you, Jim Reynolds, and about the organization that you lead. Now, Jim, you went from being a high school dropout to being president of this great ministry. How in the world did that happen? I mean, there's a story there. I think the story is about you.
Well, it was a long, drawn out process. I was raised an Adventist, and I had a wonderful Adventist mother and a father that would go back and forth sometimes. But my mother was always a strong Adventist, and my mother and father divorced at one point in time, and I started going to hang out with my father because there were really no rules with my father. My mother was very strict. You had to do things a certain way, and started hanging out with my father. And I dropped away from the church. I just kind of fell away and quit talking to God and just started living a very secular life where I was experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And of course, at a certain point, I couldn't afford the drugs that I wanted. And so I found that if I sold drugs, I could now afford the drugs I wanted to have. I liked cocaine, and that was, a very expensive drug habit to have. And it was very unfortunate, but that was where Satan took me. That was and at that point I had dropped out of high school and was selling drugs, and I started working construction. And one day I get on my motorcycle and I'm going to find out about this one job that I had been offered. And I'm going down this hill, and as I'm going down the hill, a car pulls out right in front of me, and there was nowhere for me to go. So I swerve over into the oncoming lane, and there was a car coming in my direction. So I had to swerve back into the lane where the car had pulled out in front of me, and there was no place to go except to put my bike down. And the last thing I remember hitting or thinking before I hit the car was, this is gonna hurt.
Oh.
And boom, and yes, it did hurt. And of course, back then there were no cell phones. This is in 1986. I was 21 years old. no cell phone. So somebody had to run to the house to get a phone, and I was bleeding profusely. And fortunately, the lady coming down the hill was a nurse, and she was able to slow the bleeding down, but not enough because the ambulance came. But as I understand, ambulances don't carry plasma. And so the ambulance took me to the top of the hill where Life Flight had to come and pick me up because they had plasma, as I understand it, and took me to Emmanuel Hospital in Portland. And I got to Emmanuel Hospital, and I was, well, my full face helmet had been pulled off my head, off my face, and it busted my jaw, and my jaw was up here, and they ended up having to put 13 metal plates in my face.
Oh my.
And then my leg was crushed, my knee was crushed above, or my knee was crushed completely so badly that they had to amputate my leg above the knee. And really, Bruce, that was the most fortunate day of my life.
How could that be?
Well, because we know as Adventists what happens, right? When you die, you sleep until Jesus comes. But if you don't know Jesus, you wake up on the outside of the New Jerusalem. And I've thought about that many times since then. If I would have died that day, I would have woke up after the millennium, after the New Jerusalem comes down, and I'd have been staring at the outside of the walls. And since I was an Adventist and I had gone to Adventist schools, I know what that meant. And I just shuddered to think about that. And I woke up in the hospital and I thought to myself, I've gone a long ways away from God, but really, this is a good time. This is a good time to try to turn my life around and to come back to my roots. But what was amazing in my thought process at the time is that I was worried about what my friends would think. I'm 21 years old. Friends are very important at 21.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm worried about what are my friends going to think? They're going to think I was so weak that I had to go back and be a Jesus freak or whatever,
Okay.
And so I didn't change my life. So even that motorcycle wreck, as horrific as it was, as close to it was to taking my life, didn't turn me around and turn me back to God like it should have. 4 years later, I had gotten married, I had children, and 4 years later, I got a letter from the American Red Cross. And I opened the letter, it's like, what is this? I opened the letter, and it says, "Dear Mr. Reynolds, 1986, you got a blood transfusion when you were in Emmanuel Hospital. Well, we have found out since that the guy that gave you that blood transfusion was HIV positive." And back then, now I think you can take the test and you have the results within a few hours or at least a couple days. Back then, it seemed like, I can't remember exactly, but it seemed like weeks before we got the results back. And during those few weeks, I started talking to God. I started talking to God, and I was promising God all kinds of things. He would just save my family, because at this point I'd been married, I've been with my wife, I've had children. I mean, it could have wiped us all out. Back then, HIV was a death sentence. In the mid '80s, late '80s.
Yeah.
So I remember going into the American Red Cross, and I'm in there, and they're profusely apologizing, right, for not just checking the blood. They check it really well nowadays. Back then they did not. And so they take the blood test and everything. And then they called me back, and they called me back and said, it's negative.
Whoa.
Whoa, how can it possibly be negative? After if the guy that gave me the blood had HIV, how could I not have HIV? And I was there again. I'm thinking, you know what? I should be changing. I should be turning around. I should go back to my Christian roots, back to the church that I was brought up in. But again, when you have an addiction, and of course by this time I had quit doing the hard drugs, the cocaine, the stuff like that, but I still smoked pot, and I still drank quite a bit of alcohol, and I enjoyed that lifestyle. I did. I enjoyed my friends. I couldn't understand at that point, when you have these addictions, you don't even know how you would go without having a beer. How do I go fishing without having a beer? It just doesn't even compute in your mind. And I know that some people may not understand that, as if you've been raised Adventist and lived this your whole life. But when you get out in the world and you start trying some of these other things, it's amazing how much they grab you. There's a reason Satan does this. And it becomes a very selfish lifestyle. And that is the big problem, because when you're taking a drink or you're smoking a joint or doing cocaine or whatever you're doing, there's absolutely nobody that benefits but you. You're not helping anybody else. You're not making anybody else's life better. You're not making your own life better, but at least you're getting high, right? So, that was the lifestyle I continued to live, even after God saved me from having HIV. And so I kept going. And of course, my younger son, he's about 11 years old. And we were still living in this house where he did this, and I can still visualize it to this day, where he went to he was out in front of our fireplace and I was back by the bedroom. And he looks at me, and he's 11 years old. He says, "Dad, we don't go to church much, do we?" I said, "No, we really don't." And he said, "We should go to church more." And I said, "Well, you're right. We should go to church more." And I thought to myself right at that time, because I knew how I had drifted away from God. And here's my 11-year-old boy. He wants to go to church. He wants to know what God is and who God is. And what did I do? I walked into my bedroom and I continued to live the way I was living. And I knew when I walked in that room, I knew that I would kick myself. I knew I would hate myself. And I told myself that evening, I told myself, "Jim, if you do not take advantage of what this boy wants to do right now, you are going to hate yourself later." And boy, what a prophetic event that came true.
Really?
It was only like 4 years later, and my son started experimenting with drugs and alcohol at a younger age than I did.
The same son.
The same son that wanted to go to church, right? But he didn't just try a little beer or a little pot. I mean, that boy, when he tried something, he just went all in. And that's the way he is with everything he does. And I'm telling you, it wasn't just a little pot, a little beer. He's selling quarter pounds of cocaine. He's trying heroin. He's trying, anything he can put in himself. He's trying, and he went down. I mean, at one point he's buying drugs from these bigger dealers, and he stole a printing machine, a high value printing machine, so he could try to print money and mix it in with the regular money. So he'd hand the drug dealers a stack of bills with fake bills in there that he'd run on the printer. And
whoa.
It was, and at 15, his mother...
That's a crime.
Well, yeah, that's a crime. But giving it to drug dealers, who's going to tell on you? He just kill you. I mean, it's just, it was very scary. And it started getting worse and worse, where his mother and I would wake up in the morning, and the first thing that we'd look at each other and say is, "Did Jimmy make it home last night?" And it was such a horrible time. And finally one day he came home, and his eyes were, I could tell he was high, right? And his mother said something to him, and he yelled at his mother. And then he yelled at me, and he walked into his bedroom and slammed the door. And I was like, "I've had it. This is it." I mean, I've tried everything with this boy. I tried grounding him. He'd just leave. I tried taking his phone away. I tried taking the door off his room. I tried everything I could think of to get this kid to conform to, some standards of rules of some kind. And it just, nothing worked. And I had it. And I went into the room, and I grabbed him by the shirt, and I put him up against the wall. And I said, "You can't do this anymore." And when I yelled at him, he looked at me with those crazy eyes, and he started hitting his own head against the wall. And he said, "You can't hurt me. You can't hurt." And I've never hit him before in my life, right? But at that point, I realized there's nothing I could do. I felt so incredibly helpless. I've never felt that helpless in my entire life. And this is my son. This is my hunting partner. This is my fishing buddy. I love this boy more than anything else in the world. My kids, they're everything to me.
And his name is Jim.
His name is Jim. Yeah, he's James E. Reynolds III. I mean, he's my boy. And I have him up here, and he's hitting his own head against the wall, and and I just let him down. And at that point in my life, I have never been that helpless and that low.